DAR Library Outreach presents First Chapters series, The Kitchen Front, a novel by Jennifer Ryan. Find your next great read at your library. 2 years into World War II, Britain is feeling her losses. The Nazis have won battles, the Blitz has destroyed cities, and U-boats have cut off the supply of food. In an effort to help housewives with food rationing, a BBC radio program called The Kitchen Front is holding a cooking contest, and the grand prize is a job as the program's first ever female co-host. For four very different women, winning the competition would present a crucial chance to change their lives. For a young widow, it's a chance to pay off her husband's debts and keep a roof over her children's heads. For a kitchen maid, it's a chance to leave servitude and find freedom. For a lady of the manor, it's a chance to escape her wealthy husband's increasingly hostile behavior. And for a trained chef, it's a chance to challenge the men at the top of her profession. These four women are giving the competition their all, even if that sometimes means bending the rules. But with so much at stake, will the contest that aims to bring the community together only serve to break it apart? Mrs. Audrey Landon, Willow Lodge, Fenley Village, England, June 1943. A glorious spring morning poured its golden splendor through the tall kitchen window as a whirlwind of boys raced in, shooting at each other in a ramshackle reconstruction of Dunkirk. "Get out of here!" Audrey whooshed them out with a dishcloth. The aroma of bubbling berries, raspberries, strawberries, red currants filled the big old kitchen as a slim woman of 40 added a touch of cinnamon, a touch of nutmeg. With a man's sweater tucked into a man's trousers, she looked hassled and unkempt, her old boots muddy from the vegetable garden. The wooden clock on the wall chimed the half hour, and she wiped the back of her hand on her forehead. Oh, nonsense. Is it 8:30 already? She strode to the kitchen dresser to turn up the crackling wireless radio, which sat among a jumble of pots and a pile of freshly pulled carrots. While most people kept their radio sets in the living room, Audrey had hauled hers into the kitchen when she began furiously baking to make a few extra shillings. That had just been after the war began 2 years ago, when her husband Matthew's plane was shot down over Dusseldorf. No trace of him was ever found. In various moments she tried to stop herself picturing his body, so intimate and dear to her, broken on treetops or burned by an engine fire, his lifeblood spilled over the enemy's seventh largest city. Ever since his death she had been run off her feet. Audrey had long given up trying to be like a normal person. Every spare moment was given over to baking, anything to make extra pennies, and she often worked long into the night. With 3 needy boys, debt demands coming weekly, and an old mansion house falling apart around her, normality had flown out the dusty windows years ago. And that didn't even take into consideration the pig and the hens, her sizable garden now given over to fruits and vegetables, the precious extra ingredients that made her pies and cakes. Exhaustion, disillusionment, and that panicky feeling that everything was running out of control had set up home in her heart. For the sake of the children, she worked hard to keep her anguish at bay, hugging them through their grief while thrusting her own down into her belly until the middle of the night. It was deemed bad spirit to show tears. Mr. Churchill had drummed that into them. Collective despair could bring the nation to its knees. Things weren't going well for Britain. Even with the propaganda, the BBC radio news couldn't hide the desperation. The British hadn't been prepared for war. Her cities had been pounded by the Luftwaffe. Her troops were fighting hard in North Africa, and Nazi U-boats were blocking imports of arms, metals, and most crucial, food. The upper-class voice of the presenter, Mr. Ambrose Hart, drawled through the high-ceilinged old room. Presenting The Kitchen Front, the cookery program helping Britain's housewives make the most of wartime food rations. Let's hear what nonsense Ambrose Hart has to say today, Audrey said to herself, tasting a drop of her bubbling berries. They oozed with ripeness. The tang from the red currants pulled the sweetness back, and she added a teaspoon of sugar to help it along. The government lets you have sugar for jam making if you chose to forego your jam ration. Most of this went into the pies Audrey made to sell, much to the boys' dismay. Often they had to go without sugar and jam for weeks at a time, but she needed the money. A few months ago, the bank had called in the loans, threatening to repossess the house. It was a sum far beyond her means, even with her widow's pension. She couldn't sell the house. It was her home and Matthew's. And besides, it was in far too bad a state. Part of the roof had collapsed. In the end, she had been forced to seek help where she least desired, and ever since she had been nudged by regret as to what it had cost her. A bread omelet, Ambrose Hart on the wireless explained, will stretch a single egg to feed a hungry family of 4 for breakfast. Soak 2 capfuls of breadcrumbs in milk made from powder for 10 minutes. Stir them into a beaten egg or the equivalent in egg powder, and then cook as usual. Bread omelet? Is that the best Ambrose can come up with? Audrey said as her eldest son, a gangly 15-year-old, strolled in, his nose in a book. Alexander was the eldest of her boys, the A of the ABC Landons, as they were known. B was Ben, a boisterous 11-year-old, and C was 8-year-old Christopher, who'd been petrified of everything since a bomb came down over a neighbor's house a year ago. The other boys had recovered from the shock, but little Christopher still slept with her every night. He showed no interest in altering this arrangement, even with the nightly air raids dwindling. Their fraught trudges down to the makeshift Anderson shelter in the garden, armed with a few oatmeal buns, were subsiding into memory where Audrey hoped they'd stay. Audrey knew she relied on Alexander too much, and that it was only a matter of time until he would be called up too. It was impossible to stop him from going. He would follow his father's footsteps into the Air Force. She prayed not also to his grave. She unthinkingly etched his face into her memory. "Darling," she said, chopping scrubbed carrots, including their feathery greens, "can you fetch the ration books and tell me what we have left for this week?" Alexander pulled 4 small black booklets out of a cloth bag. Since everyone in the house was over 6 years old, they had identical adult ration books, issued from the local food office in the nearby town of Middleton. The boys got extra milk, concentrated orange juice, and an orange when available. It was illegal for an adult to eat an orange. Less popular was the cod liver oil all children also received, although Ben patently refused it. Audrey had heard that some mothers used it to fry fish when cooking oil was very low. Leafing through each book, Alexander found the right week and checked the boxes that had been stamped or cut out. All used except margarine and some of that nasty dried egg powder. Thank goodness we have the hens. Audrey strode over to check. Oh dear, I need more butter. The Women's Voluntary Service needs hominy pies for the mobile canteen. I can't use margarine. That stuff tastes dreadful now they're putting whale oil into it. No one will mind, Mom. It's only the WVS. He picked up the margarine. No one expects haute cuisine for snacks from a van. In any case, everyone knows hominy pies are just vegetables and leftovers and pastry. They still need to be edible. A thought occurred to her. How much milk do we have left? He looked in the pantry. 2 pints, although one smells a little sour. His head poked out. We should get a refrigerator. Apparently the one at Fenley Hall is massive. Where would we get the money for one of those? We barely have enough to keep going as it is. Now, find a jam jar. There are some on the dresser over by the wireless, and pour in the cream at the top of the good bottle. Then screw the jam jar lid on properly and shake it. Alexander followed the instructions, and it was only when he got to the shaking the bottle part that he asked, "How long am I supposed to shake this, Mom?" "About 20 minutes. Don't move. A blob of butter should appear soon. You can watch it grow until it's collected all the fat from the milk. Then you can strain off the extra milk, keep that for your brothers to drink, and I can use the butter for my pastry. How very makeshift! He scooped up his book with his spare hand as he shook with the other. Audrey turned from Alexander toward the window of the kitchen, from which she could gaze out into her garden. She spent the previous evening picking the berries from her row of bushes, roping the boys in as usual, with the usual cheerful encouragement, followed by threats and small bribes. Last night, it was an extra slice of the gray, crumbly national loaf, universally deemed disgusting, owing to its unpleasant ratio of wheat husk to flour. At least it was off the ration, which meant that no one ever went completely hungry. The bushes were one of the first additions to her garden plot. Matthew had put them in the spring before the war. How he loved her berry scones. And they now produced well under her tender, sentimental vigilance. Apricots and tomatoes ripened nicely in a small greenhouse Alexander had built for her 40th birthday. Their old lawn had been converted into lines of vegetables forming variated strips of color. Big, bright lettuces, purple beetroot leaves, gold and green onions. Newspaper articles encouraged unusual vegetables to add variety, and so she had rows of endives, salsify, and even Jerusalem artichokes, which usefully grew on the thinner soil in the front garden. The 8 hens in the long coop laid half a dozen eggs every day, and the pig would feed the family well when it was fully grown. It wasn't strictly hers. It belonged to the pig club she'd started with a few local women. There had been talk about raising rabbits, too. A line of broken-down outbuildings could be spruced up for them, but she knew that little Christopher would grow too fond of them. The night that Peter Rabbit pie graced the table would not be a happy one. Audrey's homegrown food provided the basis for the pies and cakes she sold to locals for much-needed extra money. The local food office was also available to help with some ingredients, since she could prove they were going into products for sale, but not enough to cover her entirely. All things considered, though, the burgeoning business was doing quite well. The cook at Fenley Hall always took a few pies, as did the pub in the village and a cafe in Middleton. It was a pity, though, that the Wheat Sheaf, the one village restaurant, had closed down. It had been a keen customer. She'd have to find new customers in Middleton whenever she had the time. Alexander put his book down and began wandering around, shaking the jar and poking at the jumble of vases and ornaments on the dresser. He picked up an old silver picture frame. What was Willow Lodge like when you lived here as a girl, Mum? Oh, it was heavenly. I would spend hours here in the kitchen making cakes with my mother. She came over, and together they looked at the photograph. In it, Audrey was already tall for her 14 years, grinning at the camera and squinting in the sunlight. Her mother was in her 40s, and even though she was wearing a long skirt and high-necked blouse of an Edwardian lady, the likeness between mother and daughter was striking. Inside the pretty heart-shaped faces were kind, sparkling eyes. They both had dark blonde hair and the same wide, full smile. Beside them, her father appeared sterner than he had been in real life, and then there was Gwendolen, 2 years younger than Audrey and scowling with displeasure, her dark hair flat around her long, unhappy face. She felt a pang of conscience. Audrey had been her mother's preferred daughter, and Gwendolen had always been jealous because of their mother's favoritism, even though Audrey had no say in the matter. She'd tried to make up for their mother's preferential treatment, giving Gwendolen her toys, playing with her, letting her win, but she knew that Gwendolen loathed her for it, and she always would. The house must have looked very different these days, Alexander laughed, looking round at the chaos. It certainly wasn't the mess it is now, but we're incredibly lucky to still be here, even with all the bills. A lump hardened in her throat. Unfortunately, your father never earned much from his art. The house had been left to her and Matthew outright, and in their happy artistic world, they'd hardly thought before taking a mortgage against it, even less about following extra loans. Alexander looked around at the various odd pictures hanging on the walls. It's the obscure shapes and colors. They're not everybody's cup of tea. To him, painting was art, not a means of making money. A sigh escaped her. She hadn't realized how dreadful the debts had become until Matthew's death. Are we going to have to move? Alexandra stopped shaking the jar. Well, we'll do what we can. She prayed the makeshift business would hold them above water until she had time to expand her income. It was bad enough working all hours without having to tramp around the countryside looking for somewhere else to live. Can't we do more cooking? He began shaking the jar again, this time more vigorously. You've been earning good money. That's the whole point, though. I can't do any more. The familiar rush of being overwhelmed washed through her. She felt the prick of tears, but quickly held them in check for her eldest son. A light tap came from the back door. Is that you, Nell? Come in, come in. Audrey shrugged away her thoughts and opened the door to a mouse-like girl of 19, skinny in a kitchen maid's uniform. I'm afraid the pies aren't quite ready. Can you wait for 10 minutes? Every morning Nell would come to pick up special vegetables and herbs, such as salsify, endives, and garlic, as well as the pies that Audrey made for the kitchen at Fenley Hall. I can't wait for long, though. Nell was a bag of nerves, sometimes stumbling over her words with shyness. She'd come to work at the hall when she was only 14, straight from the orphanage where she'd grown up. Mrs. Quince is an awful flap with Sir Reginald's dinner party tonight. He's so exacting. Then she added, oh, sorry, I always forget you're related. Well, I wouldn't worry about that, Audrey grimaced. Just because that pompous chode married my ridiculous sister, it doesn't mean that I have much to do with them. She hardly deigns to speak to me now she's Lady Gwendolen. Nell grinned, and her face lit fleetingly, making her look more forthright, rare for someone who'd spent her whole life being put in her place. Lady Gwendolen has one of her wartime cooking demonstrations in the village hall tomorrow evening, if you want to go and watch. She's doing Lord Woolton pie. Alexandra laughed. What's the world coming to? Aunt Gwendolen teaching housewives how to make wartime food? Everyone's suddenly an expert, even the well-to-do. I can remember a time when she wouldn't stoop to pick up a serving spoon. A mischievous glint sparkled in his eyes. If you ask me, she's more interested in the attention and praise than she is in helping the war effort. Audrey snuffled a laugh. Her unruly children had grown up hardly seeing her younger sister Gwendolen, and when they did, she was lofty and disapproving, a quick recipe for becoming an object of ridicule in Willow Lodge. She looks like a horse, Alexander said bluntly, with that long face and big nose. Audrey cut in sharply. She attracted a great deal of admiration when she was young. Too good for them, I bet. Audrey tutted, but she privately agreed. Her sister was not only prim, but she was also smug. Ever since she'd married money and moved into the magnificent Fenley Hall, she'd become the most self-important woman in the district. Her husband, Sir Reginald Strickland, had made a fortune manufacturing canned meat at precisely a point in history when it couldn't have been in higher demand. The bully beef cans appeared in every soldier's lunch and dinner rations. Sir Reginald's business had been blessed by the occurrence of not just one world war, which was when he was awarded his knighthood, but two, the second one conveniently presenting itself just as his fortune might have begun to slip. One man's luck was another man's slaughter. The sisters hardly spoke. The years in their marriages had pulled them apart. It was only when Audrey knew she had no other option that she asked her sister for a large loan to pay off the mortgage and bank debts. Lady Gwendolen had replied, Of course we'll help, but remember that you made your bed, Audrey. You didn't have to marry an artist and have an array of wayward boys, did you? A deep frown creased Audrey's forehead as she thought about the crippling weekly repayments the Stricklands now demanded. They were slowly killing her. Alexander's voice snapped her out of it. What's Sir Reginald having for dinner party tonight, Nell? How many courses this time? There's 5 courses, crab bisque, a smoked pheasant appetizer, then sea bass roulade, followed by beef medallions, and finally your mother's berry pies with sweetened vanilla cream. Alexander scoffed. We're all half-starved on rations, becoming vegetarians against our will, while Sir Reginald eats pheasant, probably plying politicians into giving him more contracts. Audrey slapped Alexander's shoulders playfully. At least they give us good money for our pies. Without his big dinner parties, we'd be out on the streets. She helped Nell to the door with the crate, and with a cheerio, Nell began her walk back up the path to Fenley Hall. Audrey could see the side of the grand edifice from the back door, not half a mile away. She couldn't help thinking that in spite of its inhabitants, it was the most beautiful 18th century hall. 4 stories high with squared turrets, the pale brown heft was perched high on the hill, a manor house to rule the surrounding domain. They had stood in that doorway as girls, Audrey and Gwendolen, making up stories about becoming grand ladies living in the great house. To Audrey, it was a fairy tale. To Gwendolen, it was a plan. The kitchen front on the wireless droned on. As you all know, sugar is perhaps our biggest challenge. Because it is entirely imported, sugar, more than other foodstuff, has been affected by the U-boat blockades. We have to find alternatives. Honey, treacle, syrup are on the points plan. You get 24 points a month to spend as you like. Sweet vegetables can also be used. Cooked carrots have a lovely natural sugariness. For example, you can make goat's milk palatable for children by mixing it with pureed carrots. Pureed carrots? Audrey grimaced, going back to her berries. You can bet Ambrose Hart has never tried goat's milk, let alone mixed it with carrots. Alexander came over. Funny how dear Ambrose lives so close by in the village, and yet we've barely seen him since Dad left for war. You'd have thought he'd be a bit of help to us, being a good friend of Dad's. You could give him some proper cooking tips, Mum. He's a busy man, Alexander, Audrey said. Why don't you ask him for a job on his radio program? She laughed. They don't let women do jobs like that. But Ambrose doesn't know a thing about cooking. Didn't he used to do a travel program? 1 minute an expert on the French Riviera, the next on pureed carrots. Audrey glanced at the wireless. That's how the world works. Men who've never been in a kitchen in their lives tell us women what to do. The Ministry of Food thinks we women are mindless worker bees in need of a queen, or a king in this case. You'd be much better on the kitchen front than him, or any other BBC presenter. Listen to him. He's just regurgitating government propaganda. Next, he'll be telling us how food rationing is making us all terribly healthy. Wise housewives know that the Ministry of Food has your health in mind. They both began laughing as Ambrose Hart expounded eloquently on a subject about which he knew absolutely nothing. You can try Audrey's humidity pie at home. You may also like. You can find these books and more at your local library in hard copy, audiobook, and digital format.